The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the metal barriers. Among them stood 12-year-old Marcus Wellington, arms crossed, a scowl permanently etched on his face. His mother, Patricia Wellington, stood beside him scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention to the historic surroundings. They had flown in from Los Angeles 3 days ago, and Marcus had complained about everything since landing. The hotel was too old. The food was weird. The weather was terrible. Nothing impressed him. Marcus wore designer sneakers that cost more than most people's monthly rent and a jacket with a brand logo splashed across the chest. His hair was styled with expensive gel, and he carried the latest smartphone in a gold case. He looked at the royal guards standing at attention near the palace gates with utter disdain. To him, they were just actors in costumes, part of some outdated show for tourists who didn't know any better. The guard closest to where Marcus stood was Sergeant James Thornfield. Though none of the tourists knew his name, he wore the iconic red tunic and tall bearskin hat, standing perfectly still with his rifle at his shoulder. James had served in the British Army for 8 years. He had been deployed to Afghanistan twice, received commendations for bravery, and had lost friends in combat. But none of that mattered to the tourists who saw him as a living statue, prop for their vacation photos. Marcus elbowed his mother. Patricia barely looked up from her phone. She was busy posting photos on social media, each one with captions about how boring London was compared to their usual vacation spots in Dubai and Monaco. Marcus had already decided this trip was a waste of time. He wanted to be back home playing video games with his friends, not standing in front of some old building watching people in ridiculous costumes. A group of Japanese tourists approached the barriers, their cameras ready. They took photos respectfully from a distance, bowing slightly toward the guards in appreciation. Marcus rolled his eyes. He pulled out his phone and started recording a video, narrating in a mocking tone about how stupid the whole thing was. Several people nearby glanced at him disapprovingly, but no one said anything. Patricia finally looked up from her phone and noticed her son's behavior. Instead of correcting him, she smiled indulgently. Marcus was her only child, and she had raised him to believe he was special, that rules were for other people, that his family's wealth put him above normal expectations. She had never taught him respect or humility. Those were concepts for people who couldn't afford to be different. Marcus decided he wanted a closer look. He ducked under the barrier, ignoring the clearly posted signs that warned tourists to stay back. A security officer immediately started walking toward him, but Marcus pretended not to notice. He approached Sergeant Thornfield and stood directly in front of him, waving his hand in front of the guard's face. James didn't flinch. He had been trained for this. Tourists did stupid things all the time. His job was to remain professional no matter what. The boy started making faces at him. Marcus stuck out his tongue and crossed his eyes, then laughed at his own antics. Other tourists started recording, some looking uncomfortable, others amused by the spectacle. Patricia called out half-heartedly for Marcus to come back, but she was already filming her son's behavior. Thinking it would make a funny story to share at her next country club brunch, Marcus grew bolder. He reached out and poked the guard's uniform. Still, James didn't react. Years of military discipline kept him perfectly still, but inside he was making mental notes. Every touch, every provocation was being cataloged. There were protocols for situations like this, and James knew exactly when and how those protocols could be activated. The security officer reached Marcus and firmly told him to return behind the barrier. Marcus turned to him with an expression of pure entitlement and said loud enough for everyone to hear that his father was a very important businessman, that they had diplomatic connections, and that the officer should watch how he spoke to him. The officer, a veteran of 20 years dealing with difficult tourists, remained calm and professional. He repeated his instruction more firmly. Marcus reluctantly stepped back, but not before turning to Sergeant Thornfield one more time. What he said next would change everything. In a voice dripping with contempt, Marcus called the guard a loser playing dress-up, said he was probably too stupid to get a real job, and added several other insults that made even his mother wince slightly. The crowd of tourists went quiet. The Japanese visitors looked genuinely shocked. An elderly British couple shook their heads in disgust. Sergeant Thornfield's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his stance remained rigid. He had heard worse insults in war zones. But something about this spoiled child mocking his service, his sacrifice, and the sacrifices of his fallen brothers struck a deep nerve. Still, he remained silent and motionless. His training held. Marcus returned to his mother, laughing about what he had just done. Patricia put her phone away and suggested they move on to the next tourist spot on their list. She wanted to get to Harrods before it got too crowded. Marcus agreed, already bored with the palace. As they started to walk away, Marcus turned back one more time and shouted another insult at the guards, this one including a crude gesture. That was the moment everything changed. From a nearby entrance, a tall man in a different uniform emerged. He wore the insignia of a high-ranking military officer. His face was stern, his bearing commanding. This was Colonel Richard Ashford, the commanding officer for the guard unit at the palace. He had been watching the entire exchange from inside and had reached his limit. Colonel Ashford walked directly toward Marcus and Patricia with purposeful strides. His expression left no room for misinterpretation. This was not a man to be trifled with. Several tourists instinctively stepped back, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Patricia noticed him approaching and felt the first flutter of concern in her chest. She told Marcus to hurry up, but the colonel was already upon them. He stopped directly in front of Marcus and Patricia, his voice clear and commanding as he addressed them. Every word was measured. Every syllable carried the weight of authority. He informed them that their behavior had been completely unacceptable and that there would be consequences. Patricia immediately tried to laugh it off, saying her son was just having fun and that surely the guards were used to tourists being playful. Colonel Ashford's expression didn't change. He explained in precise terms that what Marcus had done constituted harassment of military personnel on active duty. He noted that Marcus had crossed physical barriers, made unwanted physical contact, and delivered verbal abuse to a serviceman. Each of these actions, he stated calmly, could be treated as separate offenses under British law. Patricia's face went pale. She started to argue, her voice rising as she insisted that they were American citizens, that her husband would hear about this, that she would contact the embassy. The colonel listened without interruption, and calmly informed her that none of those things would prevent the consequences of her son's actions. In fact, he added, diplomatic relations between nations were built on mutual respect, and the American embassy would likely be embarrassed by their behavior rather than defensive of it. Marcus, for the first time since arriving in London, felt genuine fear. The colonel's presence was overwhelming. This wasn't a teacher he could ignore or a retail worker his mother could bully. This was someone who commanded real authority. Marcus suddenly understood that his family's money might not protect him here. The colonel gestured to two military police officers who had appeared nearby. He instructed them to escort Marcus and Patricia to a private office, where proper statements would be taken and where they would remain until the matter was resolved. Patricia protested loudly, but the officers were polite yet immovable. They guided the mother and son away from the crowd as dozens of tourists watched in stunned silence as they walked toward the palace entrance. Marcus looked back at Sergeant Thornfield one more time. The guard remained at his post, still perfectly motionless, still maintaining his professional composure. But for just a fraction of a second, the briefest moment, James allowed himself the smallest hint of satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, was about to be served. Inside the palace administrative building, Marcus and Patricia were led into a plain office with white walls and minimal furniture. A British flag hung on one wall, and a portrait of the king looked down from above the door. The military police officers stood by the door while Colonel Ashford sat behind a desk and pulled out several forms. He explained that Marcus's actions were being officially documented and that his mother, as the responsible adult, would also face questions about her failure to prevent or correct her son's behavior. Patricia tried calling her husband in Los Angeles, but it was the middle of the night there and he didn't answer. She tried calling their lawyer, but the time difference meant no one was available. For the first time in her privileged life, Patricia Wellington discovered that money and connections couldn't instantly solve every problem. The walls were closing in, and there was no easy escape. Marcus sat in silence, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The reality of what he had done was starting to sink in. This wasn't a game anymore. These weren't actors or employees his family could dismiss with complaints and threats. These were military personnel doing their duty, and he had insulted and harassed them. The weight of his actions pressed down on him for the first time in his young life. Colonel Ashford began the formal interview, his questions direct and documented. He asked Marcus to explain his behavior, to clarify his intentions, and to confirm the specific words he had used. Every answer was written down, every detail recorded. Patricia tried several times to interrupt, to minimize what had happened, to explain that Marcus didn't really mean anything by it. But the colonel would raise his hand for silence and continue his methodical questioning. The room felt smaller with each passing minute. The confidence that Marcus had worn like armor his entire life had crumbled completely. He was just a scared kid now, far from home, facing consequences he had never imagined possible. His hands trembled slightly as he answered the colonel's questions. His voice, which had been so loud and mocking an hour ago, was now barely above a whisper. Outside, the changing of the guard ceremony continued. Tourists took photos and marveled at the precision and tradition. Sergeant James Thornfield completed his shift and was relieved by another guard. As he marched away from his post, his mind was on the meeting that would happen later. Colonel Ashford had requested his presence for a follow-up discussion about the incident. James wondered what would ultimately happen to the boy and his mother. What none of them knew yet was that this incident would become much larger than a simple tourist misbehavior case. The videos that other tourists had recorded were already spreading on social media. News outlets were picking up the story. Within hours, the entitled American child who had insulted the royal guards at Buckingham Palace would become international news. And the consequences would extend far beyond anything Marcus or Patricia could have imagined. The office felt colder with each passing hour. Marcus and Patricia had been sitting there for what felt like forever, though only 90 minutes had actually passed. Colonel Ashford had stepped out to make several phone calls, leaving the two military police officers standing guard by the door. Patricia kept checking her phone, desperately trying to reach anyone who might help them. Her fingers moved frantically across the screen, sending messages to her husband, their lawyer, even a friend who claimed to know someone at the State Department. Marcus stared at his shoes. The designer sneakers that had made him feel superior to everyone that morning now seemed ridiculous. Everything about his appearance, his attitude, his entire way of being felt wrong in this cold, official room. He thought about the guard he had taunted, the man who had stood so still despite the insults. For the first time, Marcus wondered about that man's life. Had he been in wars? Had he seen terrible things? The questions made Marcus uncomfortable because they required him to think of someone other than himself. Patricia finally got through to her husband, Thomas Wellington. She spoke in hushed, urgent tones, explaining the situation. Even from across the room, Marcus could hear his father's angry voice through the phone. Thomas demanded to speak with whoever was in charge, threatened legal action, insisted this was an outrage. Patricia tried to explain that the British military wasn't responding to threats the way hotel managers or store clerks back home did. But Thomas wasn't listening. He told her to stay put, that he was booking the next flight to London, and that heads would roll for this treatment. When Patricia hung up, she looked slightly relieved. Her husband would fix this. He always fixed everything. Money and lawyers and connections always smoothed over problems. This would be no different. She tried to reassure Marcus, telling him his father was on his way and that everything would be fine. But her voice lacked conviction. Deep down, she was beginning to suspect that this situation was unlike anything their family had faced before. Colonel Ashford returned, carrying a tablet computer and a folder of documents. He sat down across from them again and placed the tablet on the desk, screen facing them. Without a word, he pressed play on a video. It was footage from one of the security cameras positioned around the palace grounds. The angle captured everything: Marcus crossing the barrier, poking the guard, making faces, and then delivering his verbal assault. The audio was crystal clear. Every insulting word could be heard perfectly. Patricia's face went from pale to gray. She had known Marcus had been rude, but seeing it played back in full clarity was something else entirely. The contempt in her son's voice, the cruelty of his words, the deliberate nature of his harassment, it all looked so much worse when viewed objectively. She started to speak, to offer some explanation. But Colonel Ashford held up his hand. He then opened the folder and pulled out printed screenshots from social media. The videos that tourists had recorded were everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. The incident was spreading like wildfire. One video had already gotten 3 million views. The comments were brutal. People from around the world were expressing disgust at Marcus's behavior. Some were calling for him to be banned from the UK. Others were demanding his parents face consequences. Several veterans organizations had already issued statements condemning the incident. One particular thread caught Patricia's attention. It was from a woman who identified herself as a military spouse. She had written a long post explaining what Royal Guards actually do. Their training, their sacrifices, the friends they lose in service to their country. She described how soldiers like Sergeant Thornfield deal with PTSD, how they struggle with nightmares from what they've seen in combat, how they maintain discipline and honor, even when mocked by ignorant tourists. The post had been shared over 50,000 times. Colonel Ashford let them absorb this information before speaking. He explained that this was no longer just a matter of a misbehaving tourist. This had become an international incident reflecting poorly on American visitors, on the relationship between the US and UK, and on the basic concept of respect for military service. The palace had received hundreds of calls from media outlets requesting statements. The American embassy had been contacted by British officials. This was serious. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He wanted to disappear, to wake up and discover this was all a nightmare. His hands were shaking now, and he clasped them together to try to stop it. He had never been held accountable for his actions before. Not really. Teachers gave him good grades because his parents donated to the school. Coaches let him play despite poor sportsmanship because his father funded the team. Store employees tolerated his rudeness because his mother spent thousands of dollars. But here, none of that mattered. The colonel continued. He said that Sergeant Thornfield had been contacted about pressing formal charges. Under British law, Marcus could potentially face charges for assault, the physical contact, harassment, and disturbing military personnel in the performance of their duty. Patricia interrupted, her voice rising to near hysteria, insisting that her 12-year-old son couldn't be prosecuted for being rude. The colonel calmly corrected her. Marcus wasn't being prosecuted for being rude. He was potentially facing consequences for specific actions that violated specific laws. However, Colonel Ashford said there was another path. The military wasn't interested in destroying a child's future over one terrible decision. But there would need to be real accountability, real understanding, and real change. He said that Sergeant Thornfield had agreed to meet with Marcus and Patricia before deciding whether to pursue formal charges. This meeting would determine everything. Patricia grasped at this opportunity immediately. She assured the colonel that Marcus would apologize, that they both understood the seriousness of the situation, that they would do whatever was necessary. Her desperation was evident. The shield of wealth and privilege that had protected her family for so long had proven useless here, and she was scrambling to find solid ground. Colonel Ashford made it clear that this wouldn't be a simple apology where Marcus said sorry and everything went back to normal. Sergeant Thornfield had conditions. If Marcus and Patricia wanted to avoid formal charges and the permanent consequences that would follow, they would need to agree to everything the sergeant required. And those requirements, the colonel warned, would not be easy or comfortable. Marcus looked up at the colonel with red-rimmed eyes and asked what the guard wanted them to do. The colonel leaned back in his chair and explained. First, Marcus would need to participate in a full-day educational program about military service, including watching documentaries about combat, meeting with veterans, and learning about the sacrifices soldiers make. Second, both Marcus and Patricia would need to complete a course on cultural sensitivity and respect when traveling internationally. Third, Marcus would need to write a formal letter of apology that would be made public, taking full responsibility for his actions. And fourth, They would need to make a substantial donation to a charity supporting wounded veterans. Patricia nodded eagerly, already calculating how much money would make this go away. But the colonel wasn't finished. The fifth and most important requirement was that Marcus would spend one full day shadowing Sergeant Thornfield and other guards, learning about their actual jobs, their training, and their experiences. Marcus would have to wake up at dawn, participate in physical training, stand at post for hours, and truly understand what he had mocked so carelessly. The room went silent. Tricia started to protest that Marcus was just a child, that he couldn't possibly do military training. The colonel clarified that Marcus wouldn't be doing actual military training, but he would experience a realistic simulation of what these guards go through. If Marcus couldn't handle one day, if he complained or quit or showed the same entitled attitude, then Sergeant Thornfield would immediately proceed with formal charges. Marcus felt trapped. The thought of waking up early, of physical exercise, of standing still for hours, of being uncomfortable and challenged, it all terrified him. He had spent his entire life avoiding anything difficult or unpleasant. But the alternative, criminal charges, permanent record. International humiliation beyond what had already happened was even more terrifying. He looked at his mother, hoping she would find a way out, but Patricia was out of options, and she knew it. Colonel Ashford stood up, indicating the meeting was over for now. He said they had 2 hours to discuss among themselves and decide whether to accept these terms. If they agreed, Sergeant Thornfield would meet with them that evening to formalize the arrangement. If they declined, the military police would proceed with formal charges first thing the next morning. He left the room, taking the tablet and folder with him. Leaving Marcus and Patricia alone with the two officers who had remained silently by the door throughout everything, mother and son sat in heavy silence. The walls seemed to press in closer. Outside the small window, London continued its daily rhythm. Tourists and locals going about their lives, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding in this small office. Patricia finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain. She told Marcus they had no choice but to accept. Her son nodded numbly, knowing she was right but dreading what was coming. 2 hours later, Colonel Ashford returned with another man. Sergeant James Thornfield had changed out of his ceremonial uniform into standard military fatigues. Without the tall bearskin hat and red tunic, he looked different, more human, but no less intimidating. He was well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the bearing of someone who had survived things most people couldn't imagine. His eyes were hard but not cruel. They held intelligence and assessment. James looked at Marcus for a long moment before speaking. His voice was deep and controlled. He said that Marcus had humiliated him in front of hundreds of people, that the videos would follow him for the rest of his career, that his family back home had seen the footage and been hurt by it. He said that he had served his country in 2 combat zones, had lost friends to roadside bombs, and had earned the right to perform his duty with dignity. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. This wasn't a lecture from a parent he could tune out, or a teacher he could dismiss. This was a man speaking from genuine pain and anger, a man who had every right to make Marcus's life very difficult. Marcus felt tears forming and fought to hold them back. He was afraid, truly afraid, for one of the first time in his privileged life. Patricia tried to speak, but James held up his hand. He said he wasn't interested in her excuses or explanations. He had watched the video. He had seen her filming Marcus's behavior rather than stopping it. He said she had failed as a parent and as a human being, and that she would face consequences too. Patricia's face flushed with shame and anger, but she remained silent. Even she recognized that arguing now would be disastrous. James laid out his terms again, exactly as Colonel Ashford had described them. He added that during Marcus's day of shadowing, there would be no phone, no breaks beyond what the guards themselves received, no special treatment, and no quitting. If Marcus failed to complete any part of it, the deal was off. He made eye contact with the boy and asked directly if Marcus understood and accepted these terms. Marcus's voice cracked as he said yes. The tears finally escaped, rolling down his cheeks. He felt humiliated, but something else was stirring too, something he didn't quite recognize yet. Was the first tiny seed of understanding that the world didn't revolve around him, that his actions had consequences, that other people's feelings and dignity mattered. That seed was small and fragile, but it was there. James nodded curtly and said they would begin tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. He would send a car for them at 4:30. He warned that if they weren't ready and waiting, the deal was void. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room. Colonel Ashford handed Patricia a packet of information about the next day's schedule and locations for the educational programs. He dismissed them, saying they were free to return to their hotel. As Marcus and Patricia walked through the palace grounds toward the exit, they could feel eyes on them. Some of the palace staff had clearly heard about the incident. The looks ranged from disapproval to satisfaction that the entitled tourists were facing justice. Patricia kept her eyes down, her arm around Marcus's shoulders. Her son walked like a prisoner heading to execution, all his swagger and arrogance completely gone. They took a taxi back to their luxury hotel. The contrast between their surroundings and what had just happened felt surreal. Other guests in the lobby were laughing and planning their evening activities. The concierge asked cheerfully if they had enjoyed their day. Patricia managed a tight smile and said they were tired, then hurried Marcus to the elevator. In there. Sweet Marcus collapsed on the bed while Patricia poured herself a large glass of wine. She tried calling Thomas again, updating him on what had happened. His anger had turned to concern. He said he would be landing in London by tomorrow afternoon. Patricia told him about the terms they had agreed to, expecting him to be furious, but Thomas surprised her. He said quietly that maybe Marcus needed this, that maybe they had failed their son by never teaching him accountability. Patricia felt her eyes welling with tears. They had been so proud of giving Marcus every advantage, but they had forgotten to give him character. Marcus lay in bed, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. He kept replaying the scene at the palace, but his perspective had shifted. Instead of remembering it from his point of view, he kept seeing it from the guard's perspective, standing there motionless while a spoiled brat mocked everything he had sacrificed for. Marcus felt shame, real shame, burning in his chest. Tomorrow would be the hardest day of his life, and part of him wondered if he would survive it. Another part of him, that tiny seed that was beginning to grow, wondered if surviving it might actually save him. The alarm pierced through the darkness at 4 a.m. Marcus had barely slept, drifting in and out of anxious dreams where guards chased him through endless corridors. Patricia was already awake, having spent most of the night researching what military training involved, trying to prepare herself for what her son was about to experience. She felt a knot of guilt in her stomach that wouldn't go away. How had she raised a child capable of such cruelty? They dressed in silence. Colonel Ashford had sent specific instructions the night before about what Marcus should wear: plain athletic clothes, comfortable running shoes, no designer labels, no jewelry, no phone. Patricia helped her son get ready, her movements gentle and sad. Marcus looked younger than his 12 years in the simple gray sweatpants and navy blue shirt. Without his expensive clothes and confident smirk, he was just a scared kid. At exactly 4:30, a military vehicle pulled up outside their hotel. The driver, a stern-faced corporal, barely acknowledged them as they climbed into the back seat. The drive-through parade on London was quiet except for the sound of Patricia's nervous breathing. Marcus stared out the window at the empty streets, wondering if he would be able to complete what was coming. He had never done anything physically challenging in his life. His parents had always written notes to excuse him from difficult activities at school. They arrived at a military facility outside central London as the first hints of light appeared on the horizon. Sergeant James Thornfield was waiting by the entrance, along with 3 other soldiers. James wore standard fatigues and combat boots. His expression was neutral, giving nothing away. He instructed Patricia to wait in a designated family area, while Marcus would come with him. Mother and son exchanged a look. Patricia's eyes filled with worry, Marcus's with fear. James led Marcus into the facility. They walked through corridors decorated with photos of soldiers, memorial plaques for fallen service members, and flags from various military campaigns. Each image told a story of sacrifice that Marcus had never considered before. They entered a large room where about 15 other soldiers were assembled, all watching Marcus with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. James introduced Marcus to the group, not by name, but simply as a young man who needed to learn respect. The soldiers had volunteered to participate in this unique educational experience. Some were active royal guards, others were veterans from various conflicts. They had all heard about the incident at Buckingham Palace. Many had watched the viral videos. They were here to teach Marcus a lesson, but not through cruelty. Through reality, James explained what the day would entail. First would be morning physical training, the same exercises these soldiers did every day. Then breakfast, followed by equipment maintenance and inspection. The middle of the day would involve standing at post, maintaining the same stillness and discipline required during public duty. Afternoon would include education about military history, sacrifice, and service. The day would end with a ceremony honoring fallen soldiers. Marcus would participate in everything, fully or not at all. The physical training began immediately. 20 push-ups to start. Marcus managed 5 before his arms gave out. The soldiers didn't mock him, but they didn't help either. James simply told him to continue when ready. Marcus struggled through another 3 push-ups, his muscles screaming. After a minute of rest, he did 2 more. It took him nearly 10 minutes to complete the 20. By the end, his arms were shaking and tears of frustration were running down his face. Next came sit-ups. 50 of them. Marcus thought he would die. His soft stomach muscles, unused to any real exertion, cramped and burned. He could only do 10 at a time before collapsing. The soldiers continued with their routine around him, their movements practiced and efficient. They finished their sets while Marcus was still struggling through his first 20. No one said anything. But the contrast between their fitness and his complete lack of it was humiliating. The run was worst of all. Just 2 miles, a standard warm-up for these men. Marcus lasted about a quarter mile before he was gasping and clutching his side. James jogged back to him and told him he could walk, but he had to finish the distance. Marcus walked the rest, taking nearly 45 minutes to complete what the soldiers had done in less than 15. His legs felt like rubber. His chest burned. His designer, athletic shoes, chosen for looks rather than performance, had given him blisters. When Marcus finally finished, the soldiers were already cooling down and heading for the showers. James handed Marcus a towel and a bottle of water. Marcus drank desperately, his hands shaking from exertion and low blood sugar. James watched him with an unreadable expression. He asked Marcus how he felt. The boy could only shake his head, too exhausted to speak. James said this was the easy part, that real military training was far more intense, that combat was infinitely worse. After a quick shower, Marcus joined the soldiers for breakfast. The food was simple but substantial. Scrambled eggs, toast, beans, and tea. Marcus normally wouldn't touch half of this food, but he was so hungry that he cleaned his plate without thinking. The soldiers ate efficiently, talking among themselves about the day's schedule. A few glanced at Marcus occasionally, but no one engaged him in conversation. He felt isolated and small. James told Marcus it was time for equipment maintenance. They went to a storage room filled with uniforms, rifles, boots, and various military gear. James handed Marcus a ceremonial tunic, like the ones royal guards wear. He showed the boy how to inspect every button, every seam, every detail for imperfections. The standards were impossibly high. A single loose thread meant the entire tunic failed inspection. Marcus's hands, still shaking from the morning exercise, fumbled with the careful work. James explained that this attention to detail wasn't about looking pretty for tourists. It was about discipline, about pride in service, about maintaining standards even when exhausted or scared or hurt. He said that soldiers depended on each other's discipline to stay alive in combat. If you couldn't be trusted to maintain your equipment properly, how could you be trusted with someone's life? Marcus struggled with the inspection process. His privileged life had never required precision or care. Things were done for him by parents, by staff, by people paid to ensure his comfort. Now he was being asked to do something that required patience, focus, and humility. It took him 3 attempts before James accepted his work as passable. By then, 2 hours had passed. The next phase was what Marcus had been dreading most, standing at post. James led him outside to a courtyard where several ceremonial posts were set up. He showed Marcus the exact position, rifle held at a specific angle. Back perfectly straight, eyes forward, feet positioned precisely. Then James told Marcus to hold that position and not move. The first 5 minutes weren't too bad. The next 5 were uncomfortable. By 15 minutes, Marcus's legs were aching. At 20 minutes, his back was screaming in pain. At 30 minutes, he was fighting panic. His body wanted to move, to shift weight, to stretch. Every instinct told him to abandon the position. But James stood nearby, watching. And Marcus knew that giving up meant criminal charges, meant humiliation, meant proving everyone right who said he was just a spoiled brat. 40-5 minutes in, Marcus's vision started to blur from the strain. Sweat ran down his face and into his eyes. He couldn't wipe it away. His legs trembled. James stepped forward and told him the average guard shift at Buckingham Palace was 2 hours. The soldiers did this while tourists poked them, mocked them, made faces at them, and treated them like living statues. And they couldn't react, couldn't respond, couldn't defend their dignity. Something broke inside Marcus in that moment. He understood, truly understood for the first time what he had done. He had added to the burden these men carried. He had made a difficult job even harder. He had treated a real person with real feelings and real sacrifices like an object for his amusement. The shame that had been building since yesterday crashed over him like a wave. He started crying, tears flowing freely, his body shaking with sobs. James told him he could break position now. Marcus collapsed to his knees, his legs unable to support him. He cried like he hadn't cried since he was a small child. All the arrogance and entitlement draining out of him with each sob. James stood over him, silent, letting the moment happen. The other soldiers had gathered nearby, watching. Some had hard expressions, unwilling to forgive easily. Others looked thoughtful, seeing a genuine breakthrough happening before them. When Marcus finally composed himself enough to speak, he looked up at James and said he was sorry. Not the performative apology he had planned to deliver, but a real one, raw and genuine. He said he understood now what he had done, how wrong it was, how much pain he had caused. He said he didn't deserve forgiveness, but he was asking for it anyway. James studied him for a long moment. Then he crouched down to Marcus's level and said that understanding was a start, but it wasn't enough. Real change required action, required becoming a different person. It required working every day to be better than who you were yesterday. He asked Marcus if he was ready to do that work. Marcus nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. The afternoon portion of the day began with education. Marcus was taken to a briefing room where he watched documentaries about military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The footage was raw and unfiltered, showing the reality of combat that Hollywood movies never captured. Soldiers his age, or only slightly older, scared and brave and dying far from home. Families destroyed by loss. Veterans struggling with injuries, physical and mental. The cost of freedom and security that Marcus had taken for granted his entire life. After the documentaries, several veterans came to speak with Marcus personally. A woman who had lost both legs to an improvised explosive device described her rehabilitation and her struggle to feel whole again. A man who had served 3 tours in Iraq talked about the nightmares that still woke him up screaming, about watching his best friend die in his arms. Another veteran, one who had served as a royal guard, explained what it meant to represent his country, to stand as a symbol of duty and honor even when people treated him like a tourist attraction. Each story hit Marcus like a hammer blow. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. These were real people who had given up everything for something larger than themselves. People who had shown courage and sacrifice while Marcus had shown only selfishness and cruelty. The weight of his privilege, the waste of his advantages, the emptiness of his entitled existence, all became painfully clear. During a break, James took Marcus to a memorial garden on the facility grounds. Rows of plaques bore names of soldiers who had died in service. Flowers and small flags marked many of the memorials. James stopped at one particular plaque and stood silent for a moment. Then he told Marcus about his friend Corporal David Hughes, who had been killed by a roadside bomb in Afghanistan. David had been 22 years old, engaged to be married, planning to become a teacher when his service ended. James described how David had loved being a royal guard, had taken pride in the tradition and ceremony, had felt honored to represent his country. He said that every time someone mocked or disrespected a guard on duty, it felt like they were disrespecting David's memory and the memories of all the fallen soldiers who had worn that uniform. Marcus listened with his head bowed, fresh tears flowing. He asked if he could place flowers at David's memorial. James nodded and led him to a small garden shed where memorial flowers were kept. Marcus carefully selected flowers and returned to David's plaque. He placed them gently at the base, then stood back and, without being told, saluted as he had seen the soldiers do. It was imperfect and awkward, but the sincerity behind it was unmistakable. James returned the salute, his eyes glistening with emotion. In that moment, something passed between the hardened soldier and the broken boy. Not forgiveness yet, but the possibility of it. The final portion of the day was a formal ceremony honoring fallen soldiers. Marcus was required to stand at attention while names were read and wreaths were placed. His body ached from the day's exertions, his legs still trembling from the time spent at post, his emotions raw and exposed. But he stood as straight as he could, honoring the sacrifice of people he had never known, but now understood he owed everything to. When the ceremony ended, James took Marcus back to the room where Patricia had been waiting all day. She stood immediately when they entered, her face anxious and worried. She looked at her son, seeing how different he appeared. The swagger was gone. The entitlement was gone. In their place was humility and the beginning of character. Marcus walked slowly to his mother and hugged her tightly, something he hadn't done voluntarily in years. James briefed Patricia on the day's events, explaining that Marcus had struggled significantly with the physical demands, but had shown genuine growth in understanding. He said tomorrow would continue with the educational programs and the charitable work, and that Marcus would need to write his public apology letter. But today, James acknowledged, Marcus had taken real steps toward becoming a better person. As they prepared to leave, Marcus turned to James and asked if they could talk again sometime. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to learn more. He said he had wasted 12 years being the wrong kind of person, and he wanted help becoming the right kind. James looked surprised, then nodded slowly. He said that would be possible, if Marcus was serious about it. Marcus looked him in the eye and said he had never been more serious about anything in his life. The drive back to their hotel was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the drive that morning. Patricia held Marcus's hand, something she hadn't done since he was small. Her son stared out the window again, but this time he was seeing London differently. The people on the streets, the workers going about their jobs. The whole world looked different through eyes that were finally beginning to see beyond himself. Marcus woke the next morning, still sore from the physical training, his muscles protesting every movement. But unlike the previous day's terror, he felt something different. Purpose, maybe. Or at least the beginning of understanding what purpose might feel like. Patricia was already awake, having spent the night thinking about her own failures as a parent. She had scheduled them for an early breakfast because Thomas would be arriving at Heathrow within a few hours, and she needed to talk with Marcus before his father showed up over room service breakfast. Patricia did something she had never done before. She apologized to her son, not a casual sorry, but a real acknowledgement that she had failed him by teaching him that wealth and status exempted him from basic human decency. She admitted that she had been showing off his behavior at the palace instead of stopping it because she thought it was funny, because she had been raised the same way and had never questioned it. Her voice broke as she spoke, tears running down her face. Marcus reached across the table and took his mother's hand. He told her that he was just as much to blame, that being raised wrong didn't excuse his choices. He said yesterday had been the worst and best day of his life. Worst because he had faced hard truths about himself. Best because maybe, just maybe, he could start becoming someone worth being. Patricia squeezed his hand and nodded. They sat together and shared understanding that their family needed to change. The morning schedule included the cultural sensitivity course Colonel Ashford had required. They were driven to an education center near the palace where other tourists who had faced issues abroad were taking similar courses. The instructor was a former diplomat named Helen Winters, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes but a firm manner. She welcomed them without judgment, explaining that many people struggled with understanding cultural differences and respect boundaries. When traveling, the course covered topics Marcus had never considered. Different cultures had different concepts of personal space, different values around hierarchy and authority, different expectations for behavior in public spaces. What might be seen as assertive confidence in one country could be viewed as disrespectful arrogance in another. The Royal Guards, Helen explained, represented centuries of British military tradition and national identity. Mocking them wasn't just rude to one person. It was insulting an entire nation's heritage. Patricia participated actively in the course, asking questions and sharing her own realizations about how American entitlement could come across overseas. Other people in the class shared stories of their own cultural mistakes, some funny, some embarrassing, all teaching valuable lessons. Marcus listened intently, taking notes without being asked to. For someone who usually complained about any educational activity, his engagement surprised even himself. During the lunch break, Thomas Wellington arrived at the education center. Patricia had texted him the location. Marcus hadn't seen his father in a week, and he felt nervous about the reunion. Thomas was a tall man with graying hair and the commanding presence of someone used to getting his way. He had built his fortune in real estate development and ran his business with an iron fist. Marcus had always been slightly afraid of disappointing him, though Thomas had never seemed disappointed by Marcus's entitled behavior before. But something was different about Thomas now. He looked tired, diminished somehow. He embraced Patricia first, holding her longer than usual. Then he turned to Marcus, and to the boy's shock, his father's eyes were redrimmed and emotional. Thomas pulled Marcus into a tight hug and whispered that he was sorry, that he had been a terrible father, that he had taught Marcus all the wrong lessons about what made a person valuable. They found a quiet corner of the facility to talk. Thomas explained that the 20-hour journey from Los Angeles had given him time to think. Really think about the kind of man he was raising his son to become. He had watched the viral videos like millions of other people, and for the first time he saw his own behavior reflected in his son. The arrogance, the disrespect, the belief that money made him better than others. He confessed that he bullied employees, belittled service workers, and taught Marcus through example that power mattered more than character. Thomas told them about something that happened on his flight. He had been rude to a flight attendant who wasn't moving fast enough with his drink order. Another passenger, an elderly woman, had called him out publicly. She said she had raised 5 children in poverty, worked 3 jobs, and never taught any of them to treat people the way Thomas treated that flight attendant. She said money couldn't buy class, and Thomas clearly had none. He had been humiliated but also awakened. The woman was right. Marcus listened to his father's confession with growing respect. Thomas wasn't making excuses or trying to minimize what had happened. He was taking ownership of his failures. Father and son sat together, both of them broken in their own ways, both of them hoping they could be repaired. Patricia watched them with tears streaming down her face, feeling like her family was finally becoming honest for the first time. After lunch, they returned to class. Helen Winters led an exercise where each participant had to role-play a situation from someone else's perspective. Marcus was assigned to play a security guard dealing with an entitled tourist. Another student played the tourist. Marcus found himself getting frustrated as the other student ignored boundaries, made demands, and treated him dismissively. When the exercise ended, Helen asked Marcus how he felt. He said angry, disrespected, and powerless to defend himself without losing his job. Helen nodded and asked if that gave him any insight into his own behavior at Buckingham Palace. Marcus said quietly that it gave him more than insight. It gave him empathy. He understood now what Sergeant Thornfield must have felt, multiplied by years of similar experiences. Multiplied by the weight of military service and sacrifice, the shame Marcus felt was becoming something more productive. It was becoming motivation to change. The afternoon brought them to a veterans charity called Soldier's Hope. They would be volunteering and making their donation. The facility provided support for wounded veterans, offering physical therapy, mental health counseling, job training, and community. Thomas had authorized a donation of £50,000. but Colonel Ashford had been clear that the money was only part of the requirement. The Wellington family needed to spend time actually serving others. The director of soldiers, Hope, was a veteran named Malcolm Pierce, who had lost his right arm in combat. He gave them a tour of the facility, introducing them to various veterans and explaining the programs offered. Marcus met a young man named Ryan, only 19 years old, who was learning to walk again after losing both legs. Ryan was cheerful, despite his circumstances, joking about his new prosthetics and talking excitedly about his plans to compete in adaptive sports. Marcus asked Ryan if he was angry about what happened to him. Ryan thought about it and said he went through anger, definitely. But staying angry would mean the bomb that took his legs would continue taking his future. He chose to be grateful for the life he still had, the second chance to become someone who helped others. His words hit Marcus hard. Here was someone who had lost so much, but remained positive, while Marcus had been given everything and remained bitter and entitled. The Wellington family spent the afternoon helping at the facility. Thomas assisted with administrative work, using his business skills to help organize fundraising campaigns. Patricia worked in the kitchen, preparing meals and talking with veterans' family members. Marcus was assigned to help Ryan with his physical therapy exercises, supporting him as he practiced with his prosthetics. The work was humbling and meaningful in ways none of them had experienced before. During a break, Malcolm Pierce sat down with the Wellington family. He thanked them for their donation and their time, but said he needed to be honest with them. He explained that the charity had received dozens of angry calls and emails about them being allowed to volunteer there. Many veterans felt that letting the Wellington family donate money was like accepting payment to make their crimes go away. The incident at Buckingham Palace had offended many in the military community. Thomas asked what they could do to address this. Malcolm said the only thing that would matter was genuine, sustained change. Not a one-time donation or a day of volunteering for show, but a real commitment to living differently. He said if the Wellington family truly changed and continued supporting veterans long after the news cycle moved on, people would eventually forgive them. But it would take time and proof. Marcus spoke up, his voice stronger than it had been. He said he understood that trust had to be earned, and that he was willing to do whatever it took, for however long it took. He asked if he could continue volunteering at the facility during the rest of his time in London and possibly set up a long-distance volunteer arrangement when he returned to Los Angeles. Malcolm looked surprised, but agreed to discuss possibilities. That several of the fam. That evening, the Wellington family returned to their hotel, exhausted but different. They ordered room service and ate together while discussing the day. Thomas talked about how impressed he had been with the charity's efficiency and wondered if his company could do more corporate partnership work with veterans organizations. Patricia mentioned that several of the family members she had talked to that day struggled with housing issues and wondered if there were ways to help. Marcus said he wanted to write his apology letter tonight while everything he had learned was fresh in his mind. Marcus sat at the hotel room desk with his laptop open and a blank document staring at him. Writing the letter felt impossible. How could he put into words everything he had come to understand? How could he apologize for something so public, so documented, so permanently recorded on the internet? He started typing and deleting, started and deleted again. Nothing felt adequate. Finally, he decided to just write honestly. No trying to sound impressive or sophisticated. Just the truth about what he had done, what he had learned, and what he hoped to become. He wrote about being raised with privilege and never taught empathy. He wrote about treating Sergeant Thornfield like an object instead of a person. He wrote about the veterans he had met and the sacrifices they had made, while he had sacrificed nothing. He wrote about being deeply ashamed, but also hopeful that he could change. The letter took him 3 hours to write. When he finished, he read it aloud to his parents. Patricia cried throughout. Thomas sat with his head in his hands. At the end, they both agreed it was honest and powerful. Marcus sent it to Colonel Ashford for approval. Within 30 minutes, the colonel responded that the letter was acceptable and would be released to the media the following day. The thought terrified Marcus, but he knew it was necessary. Before bed, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. Not because his family was particularly religious, but because he needed to speak to something larger than himself. He asked for forgiveness, for strength to change, for help becoming worthy of the second chance he was being given. He prayed for Sergeant Thornfield and all the soldiers he had met. He prayed for the veterans at Soldiers' Hope, and he prayed for his family to find a better path forward. Sleep came easier that night, despite the anxiety about tomorrow. Marcus's body was still sore, his emotions still raw, but he felt lighter somehow. The armor of arrogance he had worn for 12 years had been heavy, he realized. Living without it was scary, but also liberating. He fell asleep thinking about Ryan's prosthetic legs and the young man's determination to keep moving forward. If Ryan could do that, Marcus thought, surely he could at least try. The next morning brought a mixture of nervousness and resolve. Today, Marcus would meet with Sergeant Thornfield again for a formal apology. His letter would go public, and they would complete the final requirements of their agreement. Then, if James decided not to press charges, they would be free to return home. But Marcus was beginning to realize that going home wasn't an escape. It was the real test. London had been a crash course in change. Los Angeles would be where he proved that change was real. Patricia helped Marcus get dressed in proper clothes for the formal apology. Not his designer outfits, but simple, respectful attire. Thomas had purchased a suit for the occasion, wanting to present himself properly. As a family, they looked different than they had 5 days ago when they had first arrived in London. The physical changes were minor, but something in their bearing, their expressions, their energy had transformed. The car arrived to take them back to the military facility. Marcus felt his stomach churning with anxiety. Today would determine everything. Would Sergeant Thornfield accept his apology? Would the formal charges be dropped? Would Marcus be allowed to move forward with his life? Or would this mistake follow him forever? The questions spun through his mind as London passed by the car windows. The city that had broken him down and started building him back up into someone he actually wanted to be. The formal apology. Ceremony took place in a small conference room at the military facility. The space was austere and official, with British and military flags flanking a simple table at the front. Sergeant James Thornfield sat on one side of the table, dressed in his formal military uniform with medals displayed on his chest. Colonel Ashford sat beside him, his expression serious and evaluative. On the other side of the table were 3 chairs for the Wellington family. Several other people were present as witnesses. 2 representatives from the American embassy sat in the back row, their faces carefully neutral. A military lawyer was present to document proceedings. 3 other royal guards who had served with James attended to support their colleague. A representative from the palace administration office observed quietly. The weight of official scrutiny pressed down on the room like a physical force. Marcus entered with his parents, his hands shaking slightly despite his attempts to remain calm. They took their seats across from James and Colonel Ashford. The formal atmosphere was suffocating. This wasn't the educational environment of the past few days. This was a military proceeding with the power to alter Marcus's entire future. One wrong word, one false note, and the fragile opportunity for redemption could shatter. Colonel Ashford opened the proceedings by reading a formal statement outlining the incident, the charges that could have been filed, and the alternative educational program that had been completed instead. He acknowledged the Wellington family's participation and cooperation, but made clear that the final decision about how to proceed rested entirely with Sergeant Thornfield. The colonel's voice was measured and official, giving no hint of his personal feelings about the outcome. Then it was Marcus's turn to speak. He had prepared remarks, but chose instead to speak from his heart. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and looked directly at James. His voice wavered at first, but grew stronger as he continued. He apologized for treating James as less than human, for mocking his service, for adding to burdens that James already carried from combat and sacrifice. He acknowledged that no apology could undo the hurt or remove the videos from the internet. But he hoped James could see that the person speaking now was different from the person in those videos. Marcus talked about what he had learned over the past few days. The physical training that had shown him how weak his privileged life had made him. The veterans he had met whose courage shamed his cowardice. The memorial garden where he had understood for the first time what sacrifice meant. He spoke about his friend David Hughes, whom he had never met, but whose memory would stay with Marcus forever. His voice broke when he described placing flowers at David's memorial. He admitted he didn't deserve forgiveness, but was asking for it anyway, because he desperately wanted the chance to become better. He said if James decided to press charges, he would accept that consequence without complaint, because he had earned it. But if James gave him mercy, Marcus promised to spend the rest of his life proving worthy of it. By the time he finished speaking, tears were flowing down his face. He sat down heavily, emotionally exhausted. The room was silent for a long moment. James sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. He looked at Marcus with those penetrating eyes that had seen combat and death and things most people couldn't imagine. Finally, he spoke. His voice was controlled but carried emotional weight. He said that Marcus's apology seemed genuine, that the changes he had witnessed over the past days appeared real, but that words and tears were easy compared to actual transformation. James explained that he had been struggling with this decision. Part of him wanted to see Marcus's face legal consequences, wanted the boy to truly pay for what he had done. Another part of him recognized that Marcus was still a child, that children could learn and grow in ways adults sometimes couldn't. James said he had spoken with his fellow guards, with veterans, with his own family. The responses had been mixed. Some wanted harsh punishment. Others advocated for mercy and education. Then James said something that surprised everyone in the room. He said that serving in combat had taught him that hatred was easy and forgiveness was hard, but that the hard choices were usually the right ones. He said that revenge might feel good temporarily, but it wouldn't help Marcus become better, and it wouldn't honor the memory of fallen soldiers like David Hughes, who had believed in duty, honor, and giving people chances to rise to their better selves. James stood up and walked around the table to where Marcus sat. The boy looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, afraid and hopeful at once. James extended his hand. Marcus stared at it for a second, not quite believing what was happening, then stood and shook it. James's grip was firm and steady. He told Marcus that he was choosing to not press formal charges, but this decision came with conditions that extended far beyond the requirements they had already met. First, James said, Marcus would need to continue his education about military service and sacrifice. Second, the Wellington family would need to maintain their support of veterans organizations, not as a one-time donation, but as an ongoing commitment. Third, Marcus would need to check in with James regularly, to update him on how he was growing and changing, to maintain accountability. Fourth, if Marcus ever behaved in the entitled, disrespectful way he had before this incident, James would reconsider his decision and pursue charges regardless of how much time had passed. Marcus agreed to everything without hesitation. James nodded and returned to his seat. Colonel Ashford documented the agreement formally, having both parties sign papers that outlined the terms. The military lawyer witnessed the signatures. The embassy representatives made notes for their records. The entire proceeding was official and binding, ensuring that Marcus couldn't simply forget about his promises once he left London. After the formal ceremony ended, James invited the Wellington family to join him for tea in a less formal setting. They moved to a small break room where other soldiers had prepared refreshments. The atmosphere relaxed slightly, though the underlying seriousness remained. Thomas and Patricia thanked James repeatedly for his mercy. James deflected the thanks, saying he hoped he was making the right choice and that only time would tell. One of the other royal guards present, a younger soldier named Andrew, spoke up. He said he had been angry when he first heard about the incident, that he had wanted Marcus to face maximum consequences. But watching Marcus struggle through physical training, seeing the genuine breakdown at the memorial garden, and hearing the apology today had changed his mind. Andrew said he believed in second chances because he had needed one himself when he was younger. He had been headed down a bad path before the military gave him structure and purpose. The conversation shifted to more personal topics. James talked about his family, his wife who worked as a nurse, his daughter who wanted to be a veterinarian. Thomas shared stories about his business, but for the first time he talked about the stress and moral compromises rather than bragging about success. Patricia spoke honestly about the shallow social circles she had been part of and her desire to find more meaningful connections. Marcus mostly listened, learning from adults who were modeling the kind of authentic conversation his family had never engaged in before. James asked Marcus what he planned to do differently when he returned to Los Angeles. Marcus had been thinking about this constantly. He said he wanted to quit the expensive private school where everyone was as entitled as he had been and attend public school instead. He wanted to volunteer regularly at veterans organizations. He wanted to play sports not because he was good at them, but because he needed to build discipline and teamwork. He wanted to make friends based on character rather than wealth. Thomas and Patricia exchanged looks. They hadn't discussed these plans, but they recognized the wisdom in them. Thomas said he would support whatever Marcus needed to make real changes. Patricia added that she needed to make changes too, that she would seek out volunteer work and more meaningful social connections. As a family, they were committing to a different path forward, one that required effort and humility rather than just writing checks. Before they left the military facility, James gave Marcus a gift. It was a small medallion featuring the insignia of the Royal Guards. James explained that this was a personal item, not official military property, that he wanted Marcus to keep as a reminder of these days in London. He said that whenever Marcus looked at it, he should remember what he had learned about service, sacrifice, and the person he wanted to become. Marcus accepted it with trembling hands, knowing it was far more valuable than any of the expensive possessions filling his room back home. The group exchanged contact information. James wrote down his email address and phone number, making good on his requirement that Marcus stay in touch. Andrew did the same, saying he wanted to hear updates about Marcus's progress. Colonel Ashford handed Thomas information about veterans, organizations in California that the Wellington family could support. Everything was documented, contacts established, accountability built into the structure of their ongoing relationship. As the Wellington family prepared to leave, James pulled Marcus aside one more time. He spoke quietly. His words meant just for the boy. He said that change was possible, but not easy. That Marcus would face moments when his old entitled habits tried to reassert themselves. That the true test would come when no one was watching and he had to choose who to be without external pressure. James told him to be brave enough to keep changing, even when it was hard. To remember that character was built in small moments of decision every single day. Marcus promised he would remember. He looked James in the eye and said that he would make the sergeant proud, that the mercy he had been shown today wouldn't be wasted. James clasped Marcus's shoulder briefly, a gesture of connection and hope, then stepped back. The Wellington family walked out of the military facility into the late afternoon London sunshine, free of criminal charges, but weighted with responsibility to prove themselves worthy of that freedom. The drive back to their hotel was quiet, but not uncomfortable. They were processing everything that had happened: the ceremony, the conversations, the commitment they had made. Thomas broke the silence by saying they should extend their stay in London for a few more days. He wanted to visit more veterans' facilities, to better understand the work they did, to plan how his company could provide meaningful support. Patricia agreed immediately. Marcus said he wanted to return to soldiers, hoped to continue helping Ryan with his physical therapy. That evening, as planned, Marcus's apology letter was released to the media. Within minutes, it began circulating on the same platforms where the original videos had gone viral. The response was mixed, as expected. Some people praised Marcus's apparent growth and willingness to take responsibility. Others were skeptical, calling it a calculated PR move designed to avoid consequences. Many said they would wait to see if his actions over time matched his words. Marcus sat with his parents reading the responses, learning another hard lesson about public accountability. Some comments were kind and encouraging. Others were brutal and unforgiving. He realized that the court of public opinion would always have critics, that some people would never believe his change was real, that he would have to live with the permanent digital record of his worst moment. The thought was painful but also clarifying. He couldn't change other people's perceptions, but he could change himself. One comment thread in particular caught Marcus's attention. A military wife had written a long response explaining why she chose to believe in Marcus's redemption. She said the military taught that people could grow, that mistakes didn't have to define you, that the measure of character was what you did after you failed. She wrote that her husband had been a troubled kid before the army gave him direction, and she wanted to give Marcus the same chance her husband had been given. Her words meant more to Marcus than all the praise from strangers who just wanted a feel-good story. The next few days in London were spent in service and learning. The Wellington family visited 3 more veterans' facilities, donated additional money, and volunteered their time. Marcus worked alongside Ryan at Soldier's Hope, their friendship deepening as the young veteran mentored the even younger boy who had so much to learn. Thomas met with charity directors to establish long-term corporate partnerships. Patricia connected with veterans' family members, listening to their struggles and challenges. James met with them one more time before they left London. It was a casual coffee meeting, no formal atmosphere, just conversation between people who had been through something significant together. James asked Marcus about his plans for the future. Really listening to the answers, offering advice drawn from his own experiences, he challenged Marcus on points where the boy's thinking was still too comfortable or easy, pushing him to think deeper about what real change required. Before they parted ways, James reminded Marcus that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting. That the internet never forgot that Marcus would always be the kid who insulted the Royal Guard. But James also said that people could become more than their worst moments if they worked hard enough at it. He said he genuinely hoped Marcus would prove everyone wrong who predicted he would go back to his old ways. Once he was home and the pressure was off, the flight back to Los Angeles gave the Wellington family more time to discuss their plans. Thomas had already started implementing changes to his business practices, treating employees with more respect, reconsidering projects that prioritized profit over community impact. Patricia had connected with several charity organizations in California and planned to dedicate real time to volunteering. Marcus had researched public schools and veterans programs, creating a structured plan for his new life. Old kid. As they flew over the Atlantic, Marcus looked at the Royal Guard medallion James had given him. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the meaning behind it. This small piece of metal represented the biggest challenge of his life, becoming worthy of a second chance, proving that mercy hadn't been wasted on him, transforming from an entitled kid into a person of character. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in his life, Marcus was ready to face something difficult head-on. Returning to Los Angeles felt like entering a different universe. The sprawling city, the constant sunshine, the familiar streets and landmarks, everything looked the same as when they had left. But the Wellington family had changed so fundamentally that the unchanged world around them felt almost alien. They arrived home late at night, exhausted from travel, but too energized by their transformations to sleep. Marcus stood in his bedroom looking at all his expensive possessions with new eyes, seeing how empty and meaningless most of it was. The next morning, reality hit hard. Marcus's phone, which he had barely used during his time in London, exploded with notifications. Messages from school friends, asking if the viral videos were really him. Texts from acquaintances he barely knew wanting details about what happened. Social media alerts showing that people from his school had found and shared the videos. By the time Marcus got to breakfast, hundreds of people from his life in Los Angeles knew about the incident. Patricia and Thomas were dealing with their own fallout. Thomas's business partners had seen the news coverage. Several had called to discuss the negative publicity and how it might affect the company's image. Patricia's social circle was buzzing with gossip, some sympathetic, many judgmental. The comfortable bubble they had lived in was popped, and the outside world was flooding in with opinions and consequences. Marcus's first challenge came that same day. He had convinced his parents to let him start at a new public school rather than return to his expensive private academy. They had enrolled him at Lincoln High School, a diverse public school in a middle-class neighborhood. Walking through those doors on his first day felt like walking into battle. Students stared at him, some because they recognized him from the videos. Others just curious about the new kid. His first class was American history with Mrs. Chen, a tough but fair teacher known for holding students to high standards. She assigned Marcus a seat and continued with her lesson about the civil rights movement. Marcus tried to focus, but he could feel eyes on him, hear whispers. During group work, his assigned partners were cold and distant. One girl named Jasmine asked bluntly if he was the kid who insulted the British soldier. Marcus admitted he was. She said her brother was a Marine. Marcus said quietly that he was working on being better. She studied him skeptically, but didn't push further. Lunch was brutal. Marcus sat alone in the cafeteria, his expensive lunch from home marking him as different from students buying subsidized meals. He watched groups of friends laughing and talking, feeling the isolation of being the outsider everyone had heard bad things about. A tall kid approached him, and Marcus tensed, expecting confrontation. But the kid just asked if the seat across from him was taken. Marcus said no. The kid sat down and introduced himself as David, saying he knew what it was like to be the new kid with a reputation. David explained he had transferred to Lincoln after getting expelled from his previous school for fighting. He had anger management issues stemming from his father's abuse at home. He had been given a second chance at Lincoln and was determined not to waste it. He saw something similar in Marcus, someone trying to rebuild after a public failure. They talked cautiously through lunch, two broken kids recognizing each other's brokenness. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was a start. Marcus's afternoon included PE class, something he had always avoided at his old school with doctor's notes and excuses. Coach Rodriguez was a former Marine who took no nonsense from anyone. When Marcus struggled with basic exercises, the coach pushed him harder rather than letting him quit. Some students laughed at Marcus's weakness. Others looked away, embarrassed for him. But Marcus remembered his time with Sergeant Thornfield and pushed through the pain and humiliation. After class, Coach Rodriguez told him quietly that he had heard about the London incident, that he respected Marcus for showing up and trying. It was the first real encouragement Marcus had received all day. The hardest part was encountering veterans in his daily life. Los Angeles had a large veteran population, and Marcus started noticing them everywhere. At the grocery store, at the gas station, walking down the street. Every time he saw someone in military gear or with visible signs of service, he felt shame crash over him. He wanted to apologize to each of them, to explain that he understood now, but that would be self-serving and weird. Instead, he made a point of being respectful, holding doors, saying thank you when appropriate, showing the consideration he should have always shown, true to his word. Marcus started volunteering at a local veterans organization called Heroes Haven every Saturday. The facility provided job training, housing assistance, and community support for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. The director, a Vietnam veteran named Frank Martinez, was initially skeptical about accepting help from the infamous kid from the viral videos, but Thomas had made a substantial donation and promised long-term support, and Frank decided to give Marcus a chance. Marcus's first day volunteering was humbling. He was assigned to help with facility maintenance, which meant cleaning bathrooms, mopping floors, and taking out trash. Work that the privileged kid from a week ago would have considered beneath him. Now Marcus understood it was honest work that needed doing, work that served people who had served their country. He scrubbed toilets without complaint, hauled bags of garbage, cleaned windows until his arms ached. During his lunch break, Marcus met a veteran named Carlos who had served in Iraq. Carlos was quiet and kept to himself most of the time, dealing with PTSD that made social interaction difficult. Marcus didn't try to force conversation, just sat nearby eating his sandwich, being present without demanding anything. Eventually, Carlos asked Marcus if he was the kid from the videos. Marcus admitted he was, and said he was trying to make up for it. Carlos studied him for a long moment, then said simply that actions mattered more than words. Marcus agreed and said he hoped his actions over time would prove that. The weeks turned into months. Marcus slowly built a new life. Public school was harder than private school had been. Teachers expected him to do his own work rather than having tutors do it for him. Projects required real effort. Grades reflected actual performance, rather than parental donations. Marcus struggled, pulling his first C grades in his life, discovering how much he had coasted on privilege rather than ability. But he kept working, stayed after school for extra help, learned to study properly for the first time. His friendship with David deepened. They started hanging out outside school, and Marcus learned about David's difficult home life. David's father drank heavily and became violent. His mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. David had anger issues because anger was the only emotion that felt safe when everything else hurt too much. Marcus listened to these stories, realizing how lucky he had been even in his worst moments. He invited David over to his house, and Patricia welcomed the troubled teen warmly, recognizing that her son needed friends who understood struggle. Patricia herself was changing dramatically. She had quit most of her country club committees and shallow social groups. Instead, she volunteered at Heroes Haven alongside Marcus, led fundraising campaigns for veterans' causes, and connected with military family support networks. Some of her old friends criticized her, saying she was having some kind of midlife crisis. Others admired her transformation. Patricia discovered she didn't care much about either response. She was building a life based on meaning rather than status. And that felt right in ways her old life never had. Thomas implemented major changes in his business. He improved worker wages and conditions, created pathways for veteran hiring, and started community development projects that prioritized neighborhood needs over maximum profit. Some business partners were angry, saying he was leaving money on the table. Others supported the changes and saw them as good for long-term reputation. Thomas lost some clients and gained others. His company's profits decreased slightly, but employee satisfaction and public perception improved dramatically. He slept better at night than he had in years. Marcus kept his promise to stay in contact with James every week. He sent detailed emails updating the sergeant on his progress. He wrote about school challenges, volunteer work, new friendships, to moments when his old entitled habits tried to resurface. James responded thoughtfully, offering encouragement when Marcus struggled and challenges when he seemed too comfortable. Their correspondence became a crucial anchor for Marcus, a reminder that someone who had every reason to hate him instead believed in his capacity to change. 1 year after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus Wellington stood in front of an audience of 300 people at a Veterans Gala fundraiser in Los Angeles. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the podium. Looking out at the crowd that included veterans, military families, community leaders, and media representatives, this was the moment he had been both dreading and preparing for. The chance to tell his complete story in his own words to an audience that had every reason to judge him harshly. The event was organized by a coalition of veterans groups, and Marcus had been invited to speak as part of a panel discussion about respect, accountability, and redemption. When the invitation first arrived 3 months earlier, Marcus had wanted to refuse. Standing up publicly and talking about his worst mistakes seemed terrifying. But James, during one of their regular phone calls, had encouraged him to accept. James said that true accountability meant being willing to be vulnerable in public, to let people see both the failure and the growth that followed. Marcus began his speech by playing the viral video on a large screen behind him. Watching it again after a year still made him feel physically sick. He could see himself in that footage. The smirk, the casual cruelty, the complete lack of empathy. The audience watched in uncomfortable silence. When the video ended, Marcus turned back to them and said something that came from the deepest part of his transformed heart. He said that kid in the video was him, would always be him, was the person he could become again if he ever stopped working to be better. He talked about his privileged upbringing. Not to make excuses, but to explain how someone could become so disconnected from basic human decency. He described his parents raising him to believe wealth made him superior. Teachers and coaches treating him differently because of his family's money, never facing real consequences for his actions. He admitted that by age 12, he had become a monster of entitlement who saw other people as objects existing for his amusement or service. Then Marcus described those days in London. The physical training that had broken his body and ego. The veterans whose stories had shattered his worldview. The memorial garden, where he finally understood what sacrifice meant. Meeting Sergeant James Thornfield not as a tourist attraction, but as a human being who deserved respect and dignity. He spoke about the shame, the fear, the tiny seed of hope that he could become someone better. He detailed his first months back in Los Angeles. The isolation at his new public school. The stares and whispers from people who had seen the videos. The hard work of earning trust from veterans who had every reason to hate him. The ongoing struggle to resist his old entitled habits. The friendship with David that taught him about real problems beyond wealthy kid complaints. The volunteer work that gave his life meaning it had never possessed before, Marcus shared. Specific stories that illustrated his journey. He talked about Carlos, the veteran with PTSD who had slowly opened up to him over months of patient presence. He described helping Ryan, the double amputee he had first met at Soldier's Hope in London, who had since moved to Los Angeles and become one of Marcus's closest mentors. He spoke about Jasmine, who had gone from skeptical classmate to partner in building programs that connected students with veterans. He acknowledged the privileges that had cushioned his journey toward redemption. His family could afford therapy that helped him process his growth. They could make financial donations that opened doors other kids couldn't access. They had connections that created opportunities for volunteering and service. Marcus said he recognized that many people who made mistakes didn't get the second chances he had been given, and that recognition made him even more determined not to waste his opportunity. The heart of his speech focused on what he had learned about accountability. Marcus explained that real accountability wasn't about a single apology or a few acts of service. It was about fundamental change in who you were as a person, maintained through daily choices when no one was watching. It was about accepting that some people would never forgive you and being okay with that, while continuing to do the work anyway. It was about understanding that growth was uncomfortable and ongoing, not a destination you reached and then stopped working toward. He talked about the concept of privilege and responsibility that his transformation had taught him. Marcus said that privilege itself wasn't evil, but wasting privilege was. If you had advantages others lacked, you had a responsibility to use those advantages to help people rather than to elevate yourself above them. His family's wealth could fund veterans programs. His education could be used to organize student involvement. His platform, even if built on a viral moment of shame, could be used to promote respect and understanding. Marcus then did something unexpected. He invited several people to join him on stage. First was David, his friend from Lincoln High, who had been given a scholarship to college thanks to support from the Wellington Family Foundation. David spoke briefly about how Marcus's friendship had shown him that change was possible, that anger didn't have to define him, that even kids from broken homes could build better futures. His voice cracked with emotion as he thanked Marcus for believing in him. Next was Carlos, the veteran with PTSD. Carlos approached the microphone hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with public speaking. He said that a year ago he had been angry when he heard Marcus would be volunteering at Heroes Haven, that he thought it was a rich kid doing performance charity. But Marcus had shown up every single Saturday for a year, had listened without judgment, had helped without seeking recognition. Carlos said Marcus had become like a younger brother to him, someone he trusted and cared about. The audience gave Carlos a standing ovation as he returned to his seat, tears visible on his face. Frank Martinez from Heroes Haven came up next. He provided statistics about the program Marcus had built, connecting students with veterans. Over 200 students from 5 different schools had participated. Veterans reported feeling more connected to their communities. Students showed increased respect for military service and better understanding of veterans' challenges. 3 other community centers had reached out wanting to replicate the model. Frank said that what started as a kid trying to make amends had grown into something that genuinely served the veteran community. Finally, Sergeant James Thornfield joined Marcus on stage. The audience erupted in applause, recognizing the Royal Guard from the viral video that had started everything. James looked as composed and dignified as ever, his presence commanding respect. He spoke about mercy and accountability, about the difficulty of deciding whether to press charges against Marcus a year ago, about choosing to believe in the possibility of redemption while knowing he might be wrong. James said that, watching. Marcus's transformation over the past year had restored his faith in humanity's capacity for growth. He acknowledged that some people criticized his decision to show mercy, that some veterans felt Marcus should have faced legal consequences. James respected those opinions, but stood by his choice. He said that revenge would have been easier than mentorship. Punishment would have been simpler than patience. But the harder path had produced results that benefited everyone. Then James did something that surprised even Marcus. He presented the boy with an official certificate of commendation from the Royal Guards Regiment. Recognizing Marcus's service to veterans and his efforts to promote respect for military service, James explained that this was an unprecedented gesture, that the regiment had debated for weeks before agreeing, but they ultimately decided that recognizing genuine transformation aligned with military values of honor, courage, and commitment. Marcus accepted the certificate with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. He tried to speak, but couldn't find words adequate to the moment. Finally, he just said thank you, his voice breaking, and embraced James. The audience rose to their feet, applauding not just the gesture, but the entire journey it represented. The transformation from that terrible moment at Buckingham Palace to this moment of recognition and hope. After the formal program ended, Marcus spent hours talking with people who approached him. Some were veterans who shared their own stories. Others were parents who asked advice about teaching their children accountability. Teachers wanted to know how to implement similar service programs at their schools. Military family members thanked him for his ongoing support. Media representatives requested interviews, wanting to share the redemption story as a counterpoint to the viral shame that had started everything. But the conversation that mattered most to Marcus was with a mother who approached him near the end of the evening. She had a teenage son with her, a kid about Marcus's age who looked sullen and uncomfortable. The mother explained that her son had been arrested for vandalism and disorderly conduct. He was facing juvenile charges and possible detention. She had brought him to this event hoping Marcus's story might reach him in ways her lectures couldn't. Marcus sat down with the teenager, whose name was Tyler. They talked for a long time. Marcus being completely honest about how scared he had been in London, how much the transformation had hurt, how ongoing the work of change remained. He didn't sugarcoat anything or make it sound easy. Tyler listened with increasing attention, clearly seeing himself in Marcus's story. By the end of their conversation, Tyler asked if he could volunteer at Heroes Haven. Marcus gave him Frank's contact information and promised to mentor him if Tyler was serious about changing. Driving home that night with his parents, Marcus felt emotionally exhausted but fulfilled. Patricia and Thomas had attended the gala, watching their son speak with pride that had nothing to do with money or status. They had transformed as well over the past year. Thomas's business had shifted towards sustainable community development. Patricia had become a leading advocate for military family support. They were a different family than the one that had flown to London 12 months ago. The next day, Marcus woke to find his speech from the gala had gone viral, just like the original incident had a year before. But this time, the virality felt different. People were sharing it with captions about redemption, second chances, the power of accountability, and genuine change. Of course, there were still critics. Some said he was just performing, that rich kids always found ways to escape consequences, that his privileges had made his redemption easier than it would be for others. Marcus read the criticism without defensiveness. He understood it and even agreed with parts of it. His journey had been cushioned by advantages many people lacked, but that didn't make his growth less real or his commitment less genuine. He couldn't change where he started from, only where he was heading. And he was heading toward a life of service, empathy, and continuous self-improvement. At school the following week, Marcus noticed a shift. Students who had kept their distance now approached him with respect. Teachers mentioned his speech in classes, using it as an example of taking responsibility. Even Brandon, his former friend from private school, sent a surprising text message. Brandon said he had watched the speech, and it made him think about his own behavior. He wasn't ready to change yet, but maybe someday. Marcus responded with encouragement, saying the door was always open when Brandon was ready. His volunteer work at Heroes Haven continued and expanded. Marcus started a peer mentoring program where teenagers who had made serious mistakes could work alongside veterans. Learning accountability and service, Tyler, the kid from the gala, became the program's first participant. Over the following months, a dozen other young people joined, carrying their own stories of failure and hope for transformation. Marcus didn't position himself as superior to them. He was just further along on a journey they were all walking together. Ryan, the double amputee Marcus had first met in London, became a regular presence in Marcus's life. They worked out together, Ryan teaching Marcus about resilience and adaptation. They volunteered together, Ryan sharing his unique perspective on both military service and disability. They became genuine friends despite their age difference, bonded by shared commitment to serving others and refusing to be defined by their past struggles. James continued his mentorship from London, their video calls now monthly events that Marcus looked forward to intensely. James challenged Marcus to keep growing, to avoid complacency, to remember that transformation was a lifelong process. He shared military wisdom about discipline, honor, and service. He also shared personal struggles, making it clear that even decorated soldiers faced difficulties and doubts. Their relationship had evolved from sergeant and troublemaker to mentor and mentee to something resembling real friendship built on mutual respect. 2 years after the incident, Marcus graduated from Lincoln High School with honors. His grades reflected genuine academic achievement rather than purchased privilege. His college applications included essays about his journey from entitled kid to community servant. Several prestigious universities accepted him, but Marcus chose a state school known for its Veterans Affairs program. He wanted to continue the work he had started, expanding his impact beyond one community center. At his graduation ceremony, several special guests attended. James flew in from London, sitting with the Wellington family. Frank Martinez came representing Heroes Haven. Carlos attended, proud of the kid who had become like a younger brother. Ryan was there with his family, having recently gotten engaged and started a career in adaptive sports coaching. David graduated alongside Marcus, heading to community college on scholarship before transferring to a 4-year school. The collection of people who had shaped Marcus's transformation all gathered to celebrate how far he had come. Marcus's graduation speech was brief but powerful. He thanked his fellow students for giving him a chance when he didn't deserve one. He thanked his teachers for holding him to high standards rather than accepting mediocrity. He thanked his family for supporting his transformation, even when it challenged their own lifestyles. And he thanked the veterans who had taught him what real courage, sacrifice, and character looked like. He ended with a challenge to his classmates. Marcus said that everyone would face moments of failure, times when they revealed the worst versions of themselves. The question wasn't whether you would fail, but what you would do after failure. Would you make excuses and blame others? Or would you take accountability and do the hard work of becoming better? He urged them to choose growth over comfort, service over selfishness, and character over reputation. As Marcus walked off the stage too, thundering applause. He touched the Royal Guard medallion that still hung around his neck under his graduation gown. That small piece of metal had become his talisman, a reminder of the worst and best moments of his life. It reminded him where he came from and where he was going. It reminded him that one terrible mistake didn't have to define a lifetime if you were willing to do the work of transformation. The viral video from Buckingham Palace would always exist. Marcus knew it would resurface periodically throughout his life. Future employers might find it. His eventual children might see it. But alongside that video now existed a much larger story. A story about a broken kid who had been given mercy instead of punishment, who had chosen to honor that mercy through genuine change, who had built a life of meaning from the ashes of his worst moment. Years later, Marcus would look back on that day at Buckingham Palace, not with shame, though the shame never fully disappeared, but with something more complex. Gratitude for the wake-up call. Appreciation for the people who believed in him when he didn't deserve belief. Understanding that sometimes our greatest mistakes become our most powerful teachers. That medallion around his neck carried all of that meaning. A small physical reminder that redemption was possible, but never easy. That character was built in daily choices. And that service to others was the path from entitlement to genuine worth. The entitled kid who offended a royal guard had become a young man committed to honoring military service, supporting veterans, mentoring troubled youth, and living with accountability. The transformation wasn't complete, and never would be. Growth was a lifelong journey, not a destination. But Marcus was walking that journey with purpose, surrounded by people who challenged him to be better, guided by mentors who had shown him mercy and taught him what honor truly meant. In the end, that terrible moment at Buckingham Palace had given him something more valuable than all his family's wealth. the chance to discover who he really wanted to be, and the courage to become that person one difficult day at a time.